The ship Helix had been out of hyperspace for several minutes already, but the silence on the bridge still hadn't lifted. Ray sat in the commander's chair and looked at Earth, ordinary, round, blue. It seemed that this was exactly how it was supposed to be. And yet in that familiar sphere, something was wrong. He had managed to imagine dozens of versions of their return. A triumphant reception at the orbital fleet base, protocols, reports, handshakes, questions about the legendary expedition. Medical examinations, interviews, long nights when they would finally be allowed to be alone and simply realize that they had survived. But instead, they were met by the chaos of old frequencies. What kind of protocols are these? Leah asked quietly, leaning over the comms panel. The formats looked like something from a museum. The ether resembled an archaeological dump, analog noise, narrowband signals, rough and crude, like the first attempts to speak to space. Ray was silent. On the screen was an image of the planet, the night side. Lights. There were more of them than he remembered from training models. The constellations of cities had shifted from their usual locations, as if someone invisible had been moving a brush over the dark canvas, adding extra strokes of light. "Does anyone even see us?" muttered Cram, running his fingers over the sensors. "I'm sending them docking requests using all fleet standards, and in return, nothing but silence." The silence was broken by an unfamiliar voice, sharp, tense, with an accent none of them were ready for. "Unidentified object speaking English, cease your maneuver and remain in your current orbit. You are entering the control zone of the United States of America. Identify yourselves." United, what? These words hit their consciousness like someone had turned on an old recording from a history lesson. Leah slowly raised her eyes to Ray. "America," she whispered. "That's a very old name." Ray felt the first crack run along the fragile shell of his hopes. "This is the commander of the long-range vessel Helix," he said, a little slower than usual. "We are returning from a mission to intercept the ARK-9 station. Requesting docking clearance." The pause dragged on. The air, filled with unfamiliar protocols and unfamiliar voices, felt thicker than vacuum. At last, the connection returned. "Confirm that you said, ARK-9. There was no recognition in the voice, only wariness. "Confirmed," Ray said. They expected the familiar fleet cipher, but instead they heard long chains of approvals, new voices, new questions. The word quarantine came up far too often. They were ordered to remain in orbit. No one said to them, "Welcome home." A few hours later, another name sounded on the surrounding frequencies. "Falcon 9 has successfully completed its mission, the reusable stage has once again landed, an incredible step for commercial spaceflight." Leah, connected to the open channels, listened to these reports like to someone else's dream. Carefully, she routed the sound into the shared system. On the news channel screen, a huge white rocket was landing vertically on a barge in the ocean under the roar of cheering voices. People were shouting, hugging, throwing flags with the company's logo into the air, a name Ray had only ever seen in textbooks on the history of the early space age. "They think they're watching their rocket come home," he said quietly. "But the real anomaly is us." The expected triumph dissolved into a cold feeling of substitution. They had come home, but was it really home? They weren't allowed to dock at their usual orbital station, because such a station simply didn't exist. Instead, Helix was carefully parked in a high orbit, and a gray docking module drifted up to it, angular and crude, like old blueprints from history textbooks. Ray, Leah, and Cram entered it in full gear, even though they knew their technology made the local security systems almost decorative. They followed the protocol only because any sudden move in this fragile new world could turn into a catastrophe. They saw the transfer to the base only through the opaque walls of the shuttle and tiny portholes. A narrow corridor, rough bolts, manual valves. Plates with the words, NASA/US Air Force. The air didn't smell like the sterile synthetic soap Leah was used to, but like metal, dust, and something old, industrial. Like in a museum, Cram exhaled. Only, alive. The first hours of their encounter with the real Earthlings passed under the bright light of medical lamps, surrounded by people in white and dark blue suits. In the eyes of these people there was a mixture of fear, curiosity, and professional toughness. They weren't called by their names, only subjects and the crew of the object. How old are you? State the year of the supposed departure. What is that emblem on your suit? Leah listened carefully to the questions and answers, memorizing every detail as if she herself had become a living recorder. When they finally left her alone in a small room with a terminal, she reflexively requested access to the global data networks. She expected to see familiar fields, distributed across fleet nodes, stations, and deep space archives. Instead, the terminal showed her the Internet of 2023. Clumsy websites, gaudy news feeds, videos where people filmed themselves dancing or arguing about something laughably trivial. Advertising banners. Online flame wars in the comments. In the upper corner of the screen glowed the date. December 7, 2023. Leah stared at the numbers for a long time until they turned into an abstraction. Then she slowly typed into the search bar. ARK-9 station. The results were depressingly scarce. A short technical note in an archive from 2008, an international deep space probe project, postponed indefinitely after budget review. A couple of fan forums where people discussed the forgotten megaproject that could have changed everything. No mentions of a disappearance. No distress signals, legends, or conspiracy theories. ARK-9 in this world simply had never disappeared. Like thousands of other ambitious ideas, it had been quietly shelved. Leah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. In that calm, dry phrase, postponed indefinitely, there was something painful, almost offensive. As if someone, with a single administrative decision, had crossed out an entire tragedy, and with it, all the lives it had touched. At that time, Cram was living through his own version of a glitch in the Matrix. They took him to a room with a large mirror. He instantly realized it was an observation point. At the table sat two men and a woman, all in business suits, with folders and tablets. You claim you serve in the fleet, the man glanced at the records. The United Earth Space Fleet. But we have no such structure. Not yet, Cram corrected him wearily. Not yet. He tried to joke, but the joke just hung in the air. You speak perfect English, you have an extended medical profile, the woman said without lifting her eyes from the tablet. But your physiological parameters are strange. Bone structure, adaptation to prolonged zero gravity, changes in blood composition. We can't explain that with any known program. Because you haven't launched any of your known programs yet, he replied. Instead of understanding, something colder flashed in the eyes of the people at the table. Not fear, a wary pragmatism, heavy and solid. There was no guests from the future line in their protocols. There were only options. Another nation. Fabrication. Extraterrestrial origin. Cram felt the world around him tilt slightly. He remembered how his hand had rested on ARK-9's core synchronization console when Ray made the decision to shift the phase. Back then, it had seemed like an escape. Now it felt more and more like a leap into the unknown, one they had made not only in space. In the base corridor, as they were leading him back, he stopped at a window. Beyond the thick glass, the night sky over the desert was strewn with stars. Not a single orbital track, not a single glowing linear trail of fleet ships. Only the occasional flicker of satellites launched into low orbit. It's like someone took the world off pause, too early, he muttered. Their world continued to exist, somewhere. Or not anymore. But here, in 2023, reality was different. And in this reality, they were now the extra pieces. They returned to the common room late in the evening local time. They weren't locked in, but the doors were under observation. The cameras weren't hidden, on the contrary, they hung openly, a reminder. You are guests here, and at any moment they can stop considering you as such. Ray sat by the wall, his head resting against the cold concrete. His suit lay beside him, neatly folded like an empty shell someone had slipped out of. The plain gray t-shirt issued at the base felt like a costume belonging to another person. Leah put a thin tablet in front of him, a local one, heavy, angular. "I checked everything I could," she said. In this timeline ARK-9 was never launched. The project was initiated in 2008, and in 2009 it was frozen. No launches, no anomalies. "Our trajectory," Ray said slowly, "was calculated to bring us back into our spectrum of coordinates. Into our temporal layer. But we changed the synchronization phase." He spoke quietly, more to himself than to them. "We thought we were moving the station. Pulling it out of the loop, dragging it into the right future. But it looks like we shifted the anchor point of ourselves." He raised his eyes to Leah and Cram. "We made it back to Earth. Just, not the same one." Cram chuckled, but there wasn't a trace of humor in it. "So if I'm getting this right," he said, "somewhere there might be another version of us. The ones who didn't shift the phase. Or shifted it differently." He suddenly fell silent, as if he had stumbled over his own thought. Or maybe they don't exist at all. Ray remembered the moment of decision. That dull roar of ARK-9 when it almost slipped into the black hole. Ellen's voice on the internal channel. Any exit is better than endless repetition. Their own hand on the control console. A shift, a tiny step to the side in the abyss of temporal coordinates. Back then, he hadn't thought that the price of breaking the loop might be losing the very fabric on which that loop was drawn. "We didn't come home," he said at last. "We moved to a neighboring branch. To the one where ARK-9 never reached the point of no return. To the one where there was no signal that would force a future fleet to create Helix and send them in pursuit." "But we're here," Leah objected. "So some version of these events did happen." "It did," Ray nodded. "But for this world, we're a mistake. An echo of a process that happened somewhere else." He remembered the news he'd heard over the open channels. Wars he had read about as transition period crises were still fresh wounds here. Climate disasters, which in his time were mentioned in textbooks as a turning point for humanity, were only now unfolding on screens: wildfires, floods, refugees. Videos where people argued about a new stage in AI development, tested ChatGPT, and debated whether it would become the beginning of a new era. For Ray, all of this had long been just a completed chapter in history lessons. But here, it was a future that hadn't yet arrived. "We're seeing the world before it becomes the one we're used to," Leah said quietly. "Like a photographer looking at the negative before it's developed." Ray felt a strange, almost physical pain. They had lost their already written world. All the people they knew, their cities, their childhood memories, all of it was now either an unreachable branch, or had never existed at all. And yet, in front of them was another version of humanity, one that had not yet lived through its disasters and breakthroughs. He suddenly realized that the decision they had made on ARK-9 was not just an escape from the loop. It was a choice. Either remain chained to a past that repeats itself forever, or unhook and allow themselves to fall into the unknown. They fell. And landed in 2023. They weren't the ones who found the message. It was found by those who had initially seen them as a threat. In the morning, a sharp knock at the door woke them. A man entered the room whom they had previously only seen in passing. Gray hair, tired eyes, insignia without excessive shine. He held a tablet and some old printout in his hands. "Paper. We need you to listen to this," he said, skipping any greetings. They were taken to a laboratory deep underground. The walls here were thicker, and the air heavier. On one of the tables stood a massive data processing station, next to it several old servers, clearly brought in from some archive. "A year ago," the man began, "we were digitizing old recordings from the Deep Space Communication Network. The lines used to communicate with interplanetary probes in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He nodded at the printout. On one of the tapes from 2008, we found an anomaly. An incorrect data packet that couldn't be decrypted using any known protocol. At first, we thought it was just noise. And? Leah asked. And after your appearance, we ran it through your formats. He turned on the recording. At first, the speakers filled with noise, familiar, viscous. Leah felt a chill run across her skin. It was the same spectrum of noise they had heard at the event horizon of the black hole. The same voice of the abyss, as they used to call it. Then the noise split, and a voice emerged from it. Hoarse. Steady. Strange, and painfully familiar. If you're hearing this, it means the variable worked. Leah closed her eyes. In front of her, the figure of Ellen appeared, the commander of ARK-9, standing in front of the observation window with her hands clasped behind her back. The voice on the recording was older and lower than she was used to hearing, but the intonation remained the same. We realized we weren't going to get out of the loop on our own, the voice continued. In each cycle, we reached the same point, making the same decisions. But we discovered that we could influence the outside world, tiny fluctuations in fields, micro shifts in signals, the noise you call interference. That noise is the only thing that leaves our trap. Ray listened, holding his breath. We began encoding messages in that noise, Ellen said. Sending them into the past, into the moments when your civilization was just beginning to carve its paths into deep space. We didn't know who would read them, or if anyone would read them at all. But if you're hearing this now, it means someone made a different choice. Goosebumps ran across Ray's skin. Someone made a different choice. He remembered turning that synchronization dial just a few degrees. Maybe, Ellen went on, you're not who we thought you were. Maybe you're not fleet officers from our future, but someone else entirely. But that doesn't matter. There's only one thing that matters, the loop must not remain closed. Her voice faltered for a moment, but then became firm again. If you are alive and hear me in any time, in any branch of reality, know this, you already are the change. You are the break in the circle. Use it. Don't try to go back to what was. A loop has no way back. There is only the way forward. The recording cut off as abruptly as it had begun. Silence fell over the lab. Finally, the man in uniform sighed. We thought it was some kind of experimental signal, a random artifact. But then you said the name ARK-9, and everything changed. Ray looked at Leah and Cram. In their eyes he saw the same emotion, a mix of horror and relief. They weren't lone mistakes in someone else's history. Their jump had cost them dearly, but it hadn't been meaningless. So, Cram said quietly, they're still there, inside the loop. Maybe, Ray replied. Or maybe we're hearing their last words before the loop finally breaks. And yet, despite that uncertainty, a strange warmth was spreading in his chest. Ellen had spoken to them 15 years before the project's official launch and 300 years after their own birth. Which meant that reality was not a wall, but a fabric, one that could be pierced by the needle of a message. That same evening, for the first time, they were allowed to go outside, not into space, but simply under the open sky. The base was located in a desert. The sand under their feet was cold, night-cooled. Above the horizon, the moon was slowly rising, not as a navigation object, but as an old acquaintance suddenly seen in a different light. In our time, flights beyond the moon were almost routine, Cram said quietly, looking up. People stopped noticing it. Everyone only looked at the distant targets. And here, Leah replied, they're still arguing about whether they should go beyond it at all. Or if they should just keep busy with their wars and their online feuds. Ray was silent. In his hands he held that same printed sheet, waves, noise, lines of Ellen's decoded message. The paper rustled in the wind, something impossible in his former world. We won't go back to where we came from, he said finally. Because that, there, doesn't exist anymore. Or it's cut off from us, like a loop cut off from a straight line. Leah shifted her gaze from the moon to him. But the connection is there. Ray nodded. He thought about how, in their history textbooks, 2023 had been just an item in a long list of events. Yet another crisis, yet another technology, yet another batch of news. Now, that year had become something else for him, a point of intersection, a knot where 3 centuries, one impossible project, and one decision at the event horizon had come together. The loop is closed, Leah said. But we stepped outside it. It stopped being a circle, Ray gently corrected her. It became a turn. A spiral. Below, on the screen by the entrance to the building, a news broadcast was playing. They talked about how a private company had once again successfully landed a rocket. About how wars were still raging across the world. About how the climate was breaking new records. About how scientists were discussing the first, publicly available, neural network that could talk to people like a human. This world was far from their future, imperfect, full of noise and mistakes. But now they knew, mistakes were the very points where you could shift the phase. What are we going to do? Cram asked. Ray looked up at the sky, where tiny lights of satellites were slowly drifting among the stars. Instead of answering, he suddenly felt something in his chest grow a little lighter. We'll tell them everything we can, he said. Not engine schematics and not weapons blueprints. They'll figure that out on their own. We'll tell them about loops. About what happens when you try to repeat your mistakes forever. About how any time is not a line and not a circle, but a fabric you can weave differently. Leah smiled, tired, but sincere. And maybe, she added, somewhere on the edge of the galaxy ARK-9 will still sense that the world around it has changed. Not because it was pulled out, but because its echo reached us. The 3 of them stood there, looking at the moon and the stars, and between them, with invisible threads, connections were forming. Their lost future. The loop hadn't vanished, it had simply become part of a spiral, winding up and down through time. And in that simple realization, there was something they had always lacked in the endless cycles by the black hole. Hope. Not for a return. For movement.